I used to believe that as long as I did the right thing, worked hard enough, and never betrayed anyone, fairness would eventually prevail. I believed that in a professional system, diligence and competence would naturally find their place. That belief stayed with me through the early years of my career, until the day I realized that in New York, fairness does not exist by default. It is something you either claim for yourself or have taken away in silence. This city never sleeps. Manhattan stays lit even when people like me remain late in glass-walled conference rooms, looking down at the traffic below and thinking we are on the right path. I worked at a strategic consulting firm where all major decisions were made in calm voices and flawless presentations. No one shouted. No one slammed tables. Yet every nod or moment of silence could determine a person's fate. My name is Wesley Grant. At the time, I was in my early 30s, the youngest strategy team lead in the department. I was not born into money, nor did I have political backing inside the firm. The only things I had were analytical skills, focus, and the belief that I could build long-term value. I did not like to show off. I was not good at meaningless small talk either. I thought results would speak for me. The biggest project of that year was assigned to my team. It was a deal large enough to change the firm's position, and if successful, it would bring me closer to becoming a partner. I worked with almost no days off. I rewrote the financial model dozens of times, reviewed every line of data, and stayed up until morning preparing for meetings where even a minor mistake could be magnified into failure. At first, everything went according to plan. The ideas I proposed were approved by the team. My analyses became the foundation of the overall strategy. I thought I was moving in the right direction. Then small details began to feel wrong. Several key meetings took place without my invitation. Some emails were answered more slowly than usual. And during presentations to senior leadership, I started hearing familiar phrases that no longer came from my own mouth. I asked myself whether I was being overly sensitive. I did not want to doubt my colleagues. I did not want to believe that someone was deliberately standing behind me, using my work as a stepping stone. I continued working, telling myself that as long as the final results were good, everything else would become clear. That was my biggest mistake. On the day of the board meeting, I sat at the end of the table as usual. The person responsible for presenting the project stood up and spoke smoothly and confidently. Each slide appeared on the screen, and I recognized every number, every argument, every structure with unsettling clarity. It was my work. Yet my name was not mentioned, not once. When the meeting ended, people stood up, shaking hands and congratulating one another. I remained seated, feeling as though something had just been taken from my hands without my knowing. No one looked at me. No one explained anything. And in that moment, I understood that I had crossed an invisible line. From someone once expected to rise, I had become someone replaceable. That evening, I left the office later than usual. The city was still loud, but inside my head there was only silence. I had not lost my job. I had not been removed yet. But I knew one thing clearly. My position was no longer secure. A door had begun to close, and if I failed to recognize it at that moment, I would not understand what had happened when it finally shut completely. People often think that major turning points in life arrive with dramatic moments. A loud argument, a public accusation, or a fall so hard you cannot stand up again. But for me, everything happened very quietly. So quietly that if you were not paying attention, you would not realize you had just been pushed out of the game. That morning began like any other. I arrived at the office early, carrying a cup of still hot coffee and a list of tasks in my head. I still had a few minor revisions I wanted to send to the team before the next meeting. But as soon as I put my bag down on my desk, I received an email from Human Resources. Just one short, polite line asking me to stop by a small conference room on the 11th floor within 15 minutes. That room did not have glass walls or a view of the city. It was discreet, tidy, and always used for conversations the company did not want others to hear. When I walked in, two people were already seated. One was an HR representative. The other was the colleague I had worked with throughout the recent project. The same person who had stood at the podium during the board presentation. He did not look directly at me. His eyes stayed on the folder in front of him, as if there was something inside that needed to be read again and again. the HR representative began speaking in an even tone, explaining that the company had conducted an internal review related to the recent project. They emphasized that this was not a personal matter, but a decision based on the overall interests of the firm. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I understood that I was being held responsible for a serious strategic error, an error that, according to them, had exposed the company to unnecessary risk. I immediately recognized the absurdity of the accusation. The figures they presented had been stripped of context, certain assumptions were distorted, and the emails printed on the table were carefully selected excerpts. I looked at the colleague beside me. He remained silent. That silence weighed heavier than any accusation. I understood that everything had been arranged in advance. There was no room for explanation, no room for debate. This meeting was not about finding the truth, but about formalizing a conclusion that had already been decided. They informed me that I would be removed from the project effective immediately. My access to internal systems would be restricted, and over the next few weeks, the company would review next steps regarding my position. All of it was delivered politely, as if they were announcing a schedule change rather than dismantling a person's career. I could have objected. I could have demanded an independent investigation. I could have pointed out every inconsistency in the documents before me. But I did not. Not because I lacked evidence, but because I realized that in that room, evidence no longer mattered. Power had already chosen a side. I stood up, nodded, and said that I understood the company's decision. The HR representative looked slightly surprised, as if they had expected a stronger reaction. The colleague finally looked up, but only for a brief moment. I said nothing more. I left the conference room without turning back. A few weeks later, I was called back to HR. This time, the conversation was shorter. They offered a mutual separation agreement, a severance package just sufficient to remove any incentive for legal action. In exchange, I had to sign a confidentiality clause, agreeing not to disclose anything related to the project or internal processes. I read every page carefully. I knew that by signing it, the door back to this company would close forever. But I also understood that refusing to sign would drag me into a battle whose outcome was already predetermined. In the end, I picked up the pen and signed my name. My handwriting was calm and steady, as if it were just another routine document. On the day I officially left the firm, there was no farewell, no company-wide email. My desk was cleared in silence. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I did not feel anger right away. What I felt was a strange emptiness, as if a part of my life had been removed without leaving a trace. But deep down, I knew one thing clearly. This was not the end. This was only the moment I was pushed out of the light. And in that darkness, something else was beginning to take shape. After leaving the firm, I did not tell many people what I planned to do next. In truth, I did not yet have a clear answer for myself. Every morning, I still woke up at the same hour, but there was no longer anywhere to go. That feeling was stranger than I had imagined. It was not immediate fear, but a lingering emptiness, where old routines no longer had meaning. New York continued to operate as if it had never known my existence. Subway trains were still packed during rush hour. Coffee shops were still full of hurried faces. I walked through the city feeling detached, as if I had been removed from a familiar current without anyone noticing. In the first few weeks, I did not update LinkedIn. I did not respond to polite messages asking how I was doing. I did not want to explain. I also did not want to hear empty words of comfort. I needed silence, not to escape, but to think. For the first time in years, I had the space to look directly at myself without being driven by deadlines or other people's expectations. At first, I asked myself where I had gone wrong. I reviewed every decision, every email, every meeting. I wondered if I had been naive to believe that doing my job well would be enough. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the problem was not competence or hard work. The problem was that I had underestimated the nature of the game I was playing. I began rereading old notes, not about projects, but about how companies operate, how power is distributed, and how people behave when their interests are threatened. I realized that in that world, silence is not always neutral. Sometimes it is a sign of complicity. And I had been silent for too long, believing that decency would protect me. Even so, I did not feel the urge to return and prove who was right or wrong. I did not want to write a long post explaining the truth. I also did not want to pursue a lawsuit that would last for years. What I wanted was to build something that could not be easily taken away. A position that did not require validation from people who had turned their backs on me. I began spending time analyzing the market, not as an employee, but as an outsider. I saw gaps that large firms ignored, clients considered too small, too complex, or not attractive enough. I realized that in those overlooked spaces, flexibility and focus could create real advantage. I reached out to a few people who had left the system the way I had. People who no longer believed in old structures, but still believed in the value of their work. We did not talk much about the past. We talked about what could be done differently. Each conversation helped me see the path ahead more clearly. There were nights when I stayed up very late, not because of anxiety, but because my mind would not stop working. Ideas gradually took shape, not loudly or suddenly, but like a structure assembled from small pieces. I no longer thought about returning to my old position. I thought about creating a new playing field, where the rules were designed differently. When I finally decided to start my own firm, there was no moment of celebration, no applause. I sat alone in my small apartment, staring at my laptop screen and writing the first lines of a business plan. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time since leaving my former company, I felt a steady sense of calm. I had disappeared from the view of those who once underestimated me. Not because I had given up, but because I was preparing. And in that silence, I began building something they would later be unable to ignore. 2 years passed faster than I expected. Time did not make things easier, but it made them clearer. My firm was no longer a hastily written idea in a small apartment. We had our first client, then a second, and eventually contracts large enough for me to realize that I was no longer on the sidelines. I did not try to appear in public. I simply focused on the work, on the decisions necessary for the company to survive and grow. Our new office was located in Midtown Manhattan, not large, not flashy, but solid. I chose that space because it was practical. Nothing there was designed to impress, but everything served decision-making. Every morning I walked into the office with a familiar sense of responsibility, but no longer the kind that drained me as it once had. I had grown accustomed to making final decisions. There was no longer anyone above me to revise or redirect my thinking to suit their preferences. Every mistake, if any, was mine, and every success was mine as well. That feeling was both heavy and liberating. It forced me to mature in a way I had never experienced before. My life had settled into a new rhythm until the day I received a call from an old acquaintance. He did not get straight to the point. He made polite inquiries, mentioned a few shared memories, and only then said that someone wanted to meet me. Someone who was struggling and needed help. When he said the name, I fell silent for a few seconds. It was a name I had not heard in 2 years. I did not ask for details. I did not refuse immediately either. I said I would think about it. When the call ended, I sat still in my office, looking out the window. I did not feel angry. I did not feel satisfied. What I felt was a cold curiosity, as if life were placing before me a situation I once thought would never happen. A few days later, I agreed to meet. We scheduled the meeting in one of my company's conference rooms in the late afternoon. When he walked in, I immediately noticed the change. Not in appearance, but in the way he moved and looked around. The confidence he once had was gone. In its place was a caution I had never seen in him before. He spoke more than I expected. He talked about being pushed out of the old firm, about bad decisions, about how quickly the market had turned its back on him. I listened without interrupting. I did not need to ask questions. What he said only confirmed what I had already assumed. When he stopped talking, the room fell silent. I knew he was waiting for a reaction from me, a reproach, a sarcastic remark, or at least a sign that I clearly remembered what had happened in the past. But I did not give him that. I simply asked a straightforward question about what he could bring if given another chance to work. That question caught him off guard. I could clearly see the confusion in his eyes. This was not the conversation he had prepared for. He answered cautiously, speaking about experience, about what he had done over the years. I nodded, noted a few points, and said that I would consider it. The meeting ended without a clear conclusion. When he left, I remained alone. I did not feel that I had just won or lost. I only realized that our positions had completely reversed. 2 years earlier, I had been the one walking out of a building in silence. Now he was the one leaving my office with uncertainty evident in every step. That evening, I did not make a decision right away. I needed time to understand my own motives. I asked myself whether I was opening a door that should remain closed. But I also knew that some opportunities in life are not about taking revenge with words, but about taking revenge with position. And this time, I was standing in the position to choose. After that meeting, I did not make a decision right away. I let everything settle, the same way I always did with important choices. I observed my emotions over the following days, looking for any sign of anger or satisfaction rising to the surface. But there was none. The only thing present was a cold clarity, as if I were standing outside my own story. I thought back to the past, when a single email from senior management was enough to keep me awake at night. When someone else's power could determine my entire future in a closed-door meeting. Now, everything was different. I was no longer pulled into other people's emotions. I had distance, and that distance allowed me to see more clearly. I called the intermediary and said that I was willing to consider a form of collaboration. Not unconditional help, but a relationship defined clearly from the beginning. I emphasized that everything had to be transparent, and that I had no intention of reopening any stories from the past. The intermediary was silent for a few seconds, and then agreed to arrange a second meeting. That meeting was brief. I laid out my terms directly. I offered a position sufficient for him to maintain his life, sufficient to use his experience, but not sufficient for him to hold decision-making power. No equity, no control. Just a clearly defined role within a structure for which I held final responsibility. He listened closely. I could see the tension in the way he remained silent. I did not need to emphasize the reversal of our positions. It was present in every small detail, from the way he waited for me to speak first, to how carefully he weighed each response. When I asked whether he accepted the terms, he did not answer immediately. The pause lasted longer than I expected. I did not rush him. I knew this was not just a career decision for him. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power had changed. Finally, he nodded. That nod did not carry relief, but a cautious acceptance. We signed the contract the following week. I read every clause carefully, not because I distrusted him, but because I had learned that trust must be built on structure, not emotion. When he signed his name, I realized that this moment did not bring me a sense of victory. It only brought me a sense of control. The first days of his work at my firm passed in silence. I did not announce anything to the team about our past. I did not want to create any narrative beyond the work itself. To everyone else, he was simply a new hire. To me, he was a living reminder of how quickly positions can change. I treated him fairly. I assigned tasks clearly, evaluated based on results, and showed neither special favor nor particular harshness. That calmness seemed to unsettle him more than punishment ever could. There was no conflict, no confrontation, only an undeniable reality. He was working within a system I had built. At times, I asked myself whether I had gone too far, whether helping him return was a strategic mistake. But whenever that thought surfaced, I remembered the helplessness I felt the day I was pushed out. And I realized that what I was doing was not revenge driven by emotion, but the restoration of proper order. I had helped the one who betrayed me return. Not to prove that I was generous and not to display power. I did it because I understood that sometimes the heaviest punishment is not being removed, but being allowed to stay and having to watch someone else lead the path you once believed you deserved. When he officially became part of my firm, things did not change in the way outsiders might imagine. There was no open tension, no hidden confrontations, and no effort to prove who held power. Everything functioned normally, and it was that very normality that unsettled him the most. Work days passed with a steady rhythm. Meetings followed meetings. Reports were delivered on time. Strategic decisions continued to be made in the familiar conference room, where I now sat in a position I had once only dared to imagine. I did not need to remind anyone of my role. That position spoke for itself in the way people looked at me while waiting for the final answer. He worked hard. I could not deny that. His experience was useful in several complex projects, and I acknowledged those contributions clearly. But I did not grant him any authority beyond what we had agreed upon. Every proposal he made was considered, yet the final decision always belonged to me. There were no exceptions. What caught my attention was the way he watched me during major meetings. His gaze no longer carried its former confidence, but a cautious scrutiny. I knew he was trying to find his new boundaries, trying to understand how far I would go. But I gave him no clues. I kept my tone even, my responses consistent, and revealed no personal emotion. That silence gradually became an invisible pressure. There were no reproaches to push back against, no obvious injustice to resent. Only a new order operating smoothly, one he was forced to adapt to. I realized that in many situations, silence is not avoidance, but the way power quietly asserts itself. Once during a meeting with an important client, I was asked about the firm's long-term direction. I answered slowly, laying out each step and the reasoning behind every decision. When I finished, the room fell silent for a few seconds before people nodded in agreement. I saw him sitting across the table, quietly taking notes, as if trying to keep pace with a rhythm that no longer belonged to him. After that meeting, he sent me a brief email suggesting a few minor improvements to our workflow. I read it, considered it, then replied with a short response, accepting part of it and rejecting the rest. No lengthy explanation, no emotion, just a decision. I knew that kind of response would make his position very clear to him. Over time, I realized that I did not need to do anything more to emphasize the reversal. The work itself did that. Each new success, each major contract the firm secured, my name was mentioned first. I did not seek that recognition, but I did not avoid it either. I understood that in this environment, accepting one's position is part of responsibility. He was present in those moments, but always behind. No one spoke about our past, and I did not want anyone to. Yet I knew that for him, every success of mine was a silent reminder of what had been lost. Not because I deliberately displayed it, but because I no longer needed to hide. There were evenings when the office was empty, and I sat alone thinking about the path I had taken. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel bitter. What I felt was certainty. I had moved past the stage of needing recognition and entered a stage where my silence was enough to shape the space around me. Silence had become a form of power, not because it made others afraid, but because it made them pay attention. And in the world I now lived in, that attention was the clearest sign that my position was no longer something to be questioned. I noticed the change not in a dramatic moment, but through small details repeated day after day. The way people paused when I entered a room. The way conversations naturally slowed to wait for me to speak. I did not ask for it, but I did not refuse it either. My position had become a fixed point around which all movement had to adjust. The firm continued to grow along the direction I had outlined from the beginning. We became more selective with clients, declined projects that did not fit, and focused on long-term relationships. That choice slowed revenue growth in the short term, but created the stability I had always believed was necessary. I no longer had to chase numbers to prove my value. My name began to surface in conversations outside the firm. Not loudly, but through brief introductions and discreet inquiries. I did not actively build a personal image, but I understood that this presence was a natural consequence of what I was doing, and I accepted it as part of the role I carried. He noticed the change as well. I could see it in the way he listened when others mentioned my name, in the brief pause of his gaze whenever an important decision was made without requiring his input. He continued to work diligently, continued to complete the tasks assigned to him, but the distance between us had become clearer than ever. One evening, we attended an industry event together, not as individuals, but as representatives of the firm. I was invited to give a brief talk on market trends. I stepped onto the stage with a calmness I never thought I would possess. I did not speak about personal success. I spoke about building sustainable value in a volatile environment. When I finished, the applause lasted just long enough. Not excessive, but certain. I stepped down, shook hands with a few familiar faces, and continued with brief conversations. Throughout it all, I did not look in his direction. I did not need to. I knew he was there, witnessing everything in silence. After the event, we returned to the office late. The city lights were on, and the familiar space felt quieter than usual. He paused outside my office door, as if weighing something. I said nothing, simply waited. Finally, he gave a slight nod and said that it had been a good talk, then walked away. That comment carried no rivalry or challenge. It sounded like an unspoken acknowledgement that the boundary between us had been clearly established. I responded with a similar nod. No more words. None were necessary. That night I stayed alone in the office longer than usual. I thought about the path I had taken, from the days I was pushed aside to this moment. I did not feel that I had won in the conventional sense. I had not defeated anyone in a direct confrontation. But I had reached a position from which no one could remove me without paying a significant cost. That position was not built on words or titles. It was built on consistent decisions, on the ability to take responsibility, and on not allowing momentary emotions to dictate actions. I understood that from this point forward, my path would present new challenges. But at least I knew I was standing on a foundation that no one could easily cross. That afternoon unfolded like any other. There was no special meeting, no important announcement, and no sign that it would become a moment of closure. I finished a few emails, signed several documents, and glanced at the clock as the office gradually emptied. Outside, the city began to slow, lights from surrounding buildings reflecting off the glass walls of my office. He knocked on the door as I was clearing my desk. The sound was neither hurried nor hesitant. I told him to come in. When the door closed behind him, the room grew so quiet that I could clearly hear the steady hum of the air conditioning above. He stood there for a few seconds before sitting down, as if weighing every movement. He did not begin with work. That caught my attention. He said he wanted to talk, not as an employee, but as a person. I nodded, signaling for him to continue. I did not predict what he would say, but I knew this conversation would happen sooner or later. He spoke about his time working at my firm, about being allowed back into the industry under circumstances he never thought he would face. He admitted that watching me make decisions each day, watching the company grow according to my direction, had been difficult. Not because I treated him poorly, but because I did not. When he mentioned the past, his voice slowed. He said he had been wrong, that what he had done back then came from fear of being left behind, that he had not thought the consequences would last this long. I listened without interrupting. I did not feel the need to react. Those words did not make me feel lighter, but they did not burden me either. Eventually, he apologized. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a brief sentence spoken after a long pause. I looked at him, and in that moment, I realized that real power does not lie in forcing someone to bow, but in no longer needing it. I said that I had not brought the past into this company, that I had made decisions based on what was right for the present. I said that I held no resentment, but also needed no redemption. What had happened had already served its purpose. It brought me here. He fell silent and gave a small nod. I knew that answer did not grant him full release, but I also knew it was the most honest answer I could give. I stood up and ended the conversation with a brief, professional handshake. When he left the room, I remained alone. I looked around the familiar space where important decisions had been made. I did not feel that I had just completed an act of revenge in the conventional sense. There was no climax, no collapse, only a quiet closure. I turned off the lights in my office and stepped outside. The hallway was empty, and the elevator carried me down to the lobby in silence. When the glass doors opened, the cool evening air touched my face. I stepped onto the street, blending into the stream of people heading home after a long day. I understood that what he faced each day was not my words, but the reality I was living. I did not need to revisit the past. I did not need to prove that I had been right. My life had become the answer. And that was the only form of revenge I ever needed.